thank you very much, Ashley, for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak here to you tonight. So thank you very much for coming to listen. So there's no doubt that the 17th century English civil wars left a deep impression on the national population. If we look at some figures here, we can see that a vast proportion of the population was mobilised for the various armies, as many as 1 in 4 adult males in England, whilst recent estimates suggest that across the British Isles, a greater percentage of the population died as a result of the civil wars than in both world wars. Few localities were not first-hand witnesses to the fighting, whilst references to the wars were still afforded a prominent place in popular folk traditions well into the 19th century. So as historians of the Civil Wars, we are blessed with a vast number of original sources that can help us understand what it must have been like to fight in and live through the conflict. So here are just a few samples here. Letters, diaries and other accounts all open our eyes to the personal narratives of both leading figures and more obscure individuals. Yet these sources largely tell us the stories of the literate elites. What of the ordinary soldiers, the Tommies of the rank and file, and the families who waved them off to war? As the historian Diane Purkis once reminded us, the Civil War was a war with patient foot soldiers as well as dashing commanders. We need to understand the lives of those who lived under leaders, otherwise their leadership hardly matters. It's perhaps inevitable that these lives of so-called ordinary people have often remained obscure. However, thousands of documents detailing the experiences of these people during the Civil Wars are currently being unearthed by the Civil Wars Petitions Project. Here's an example of a petition here. So during the Civil Wars, thousands of war pensions and other financial gratuities were awarded to wounded soldiers and the widows and orphans of those who had died in service. In order to claim a pension or gratuity, veterans and bereaved family members had, often with the help of a scribe, to draw up a petition outlining their or their family members' war service. These petitions thus provide many testimonies in which it is possible to hear the voices of the ordinary men and women who lived and fought during the Civil Wars. So Civil War Petitions is a 4-year research project. We're about a year into it so far. It's very much a team effort run between the universities of Leicester, Nottingham, Cardiff and Southampton. And we are very lucky to be generously funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And the aim of this project is to track down all the surviving petitions from main soldiers and war widows from the Civil Wars, which are deposited in the county record offices, the National Archives and other repositories around the country. We are developing a freely accessible website with quality images of these petitions, transcriptions of the text and records of the payments which were made as a result of these petitions. In total, we anticipate there will be over 4,000 petitions and tens of thousands of payment records. In my talk to you tonight, I'd like to demonstrate how we can use these petitions to uncover what life was like for ordinary soldiers and civilians during the Civil Wars. The petitions reveal what might have induced men to enlist in the various armies and what life was like for them on campaign. We can learn more about the various battles that these men fought in and the quality of medical care available to the wounded. We can also understand more about the families that soldiers left behind and the impact that bereavement had on their daily lives. Finally, we can discover some of the ingenious ways that the wounded and bereaved negotiated with the authorities to obtain welfare, which was usually restricted by a tight budget, as well as find out more about the contested memories of this conflict. So first of all, how did the pension scheme work? Many soldiers had actually been able to claim financial relief from the state since 1593. In this year, the Act for Relief for Soldiers created a system of parochial taxation, which was administered on a countrywide basis by special county treasurers. The money was then distributed by the Justices of the Peace at the Courts of Quarter Session in each county. However, during the Civil War years, the whole system was overhauled. In 1642, pensions were, for the first time, also made available to the widows and orphans of those who had died in service, whilst in 1647, Parliament increased the amount of money collected and paid out, and pensions were denied to royalists. Following the Restoration, when the boot was on the other foot, the policy was naturally reversed. In 1662, pensions were officially removed from parliamentarians and handed to their former enemies. The monetary rates were again increased, and claimants had to demonstrate their unswerving loyalty to the Crown. The 1662 Act lapsed in 1679, and although the Elizabethan legislation was still in force, the increased rates were no longer valid. The pension scheme became largely ineffectual, although some soldiers continued to petition and receive pensions. In order to obtain a pension, claimants had to present a petition to their local quarter sessions. Often, the petitions of main soldiers were accompanied by a certificate from the soldier's regimental commander testifying to his service, or a certificate from a medical practitioner outlining the extent of his wounds. Most petitions were submitted... we've gone too far, sorry. Most petitions were submitted directly to the quarter sessions, though some claimants appealed to other authorities, such as borough corporations, the county committees set up to coordinate Parliament's war effort, military governors, or even directly to leading figures such as Oliver Cromwell or Charles II. These petitions were usually referred on to the relevant county quarter sessions, with a note of endorsement if the petitioner was lucky. As noted, most petitions were written down on the claimant's behalf by a scribe, probably a local church minister, schoolmaster, literate neighbour, or even the clerk of the court. We might therefore question how far these documents really reveal the so-called authentic voice of the ordinary men and women they claim to represent. Scribes certainly appear to have determined the precise wording of the text, did their best to ensure that the petitions would impress, and chose the conventional formulae with which the documents began and ended. Yet the crucial central passages of the petitions relied on the testimony of the claimants themselves, which scribes seem to have just transcribed in a shortened form. For example, we know that Elizabeth Newham of Nottinghamshire was illiterate and required a scribe to draft her petition. As you can see here at the bottom, she signed her petition with a mark. Yet her petition is entirely written in the first person, as you can see here, I, rather than the conventional third person, your petitioner. A similar slip of the quill occurs in the Denbighshire petition of Reeves Ithell, who noted, I was very poor and have so continued ever since. Interestingly, as you can see here, and throughout the petition, it's been corrected to he. It is unclear, as our project co-investigator Lloyd Bowen remarked, if the scribes had just become so engrossed in their subject's story, or simply that their mind had wandered during the process of transcribing, perhaps after a jug or two of ale. The petitions themselves tend to be organised into three parts. The first explains how the claimant or their husband came to join an army, and when and where they fought. The second dwells on the moment and manner of the soldier's wounding or death. And the third explains how this had affected the claimant's life subsequently, which incorporated the request for aid. It is perhaps unsurprising that petitions begin with the moment of enlistment, the cataclysmic shift that occurs when an individual is catapulted from the civilian into military life is one that is well known to sear itself onto a soldier's memory. Some veterans protested their fidelity to their respective cause, such as William Huntley of Alnwick in Northumberland. He claimed that he did and of his own free voluntary will went under the command of Charles Branding, Esquire, a soldier, for the service of our sovereign Lord Charles I of blessed memory. We should not be dismissive of claims of voluntary enlistment, but these do need to be treated cautiously. It must be remembered that the primary aim of these documents was to secure money for the claimant, and so naturally, petitioners portrayed themselves in the best possible light. As another of our project team, Mark Stoyle, has argued, anyone hoping to find confessions of cowardice or disloyalty in the petitions will search in vain. The veterans are consistently presented as paragons of military virtue. In light of this, it is perhaps surprising, therefore, that the number of petitioners who quite readily admit to being conscripted. Thomas Butcher of Langham, in Essex, for example, informed the magistrates that he was pressed for the service of the Parliament against Lynn in the county of Norfolk under the Earl of Manchester. Conscription during the Civil Wars, I think it is fair to say, did not have a reputation for enlisting the most savoury of characters. Colonel John Venn of the Honourable Artillery Company remarked that most counties pressed the scum of all their inhabitants. Yet, as long as those who had been impressed showed that they had fought loyally, they seem to have had as much success in securing a pension as those who claimed to have enlisted voluntarily. In a study of petitioners from Devon, Mark Stoyle observed that those who had claimed to have volunteered were cavalrymen who were likely to have been of a more elevated social status than the foot sloggers and the infantry. And it'll be interesting to see how far this finding is mirrored in the petitions from across the rest of the country. In addition, by conducting a nationwide survey of the petitions, it will be possible for our project to uncover wider patterns of recruitment. So Mark discovered in Devon and Leicester, for example, that it is possible to use the petitioner's place of residence to detect distinct pockets of parliamentarian and royalist sympathies. I don't know if you can see that from these maps here. However, in Essex, another of our project team, David Appleby, found a different situation altogether. Almost all the petitioners in Essex come from the northern parts of the county, so you see these blue dots here, an area which was reliant on the cloth trade. The period directly prior to the Civil Wars had been a difficult time for this industry, and thus it seems that economic hardship forced many of the men from this area into the army. Not an unfamiliar story in the history of army recruitment. And I should say, this is just taken from the evidence of the petitions. Once you put the payment details in here as well, this map becomes a lot more concentrated. And finally, elsewhere in Hertfordshire, David's student Hannah Cheadle discovered that the petitions demonstrated a pattern of recruitment that directly reflected the route of the modern A414. This is a major route traversing the county, and it seems to have been a well-trodden path for the recruiting sergeants. Interestingly, actually, if you look back to the Essex one, you can see there's someone on A414 there as well. Following the moment of enlistment, the petitions often move on to narrate many of the harsh realities of campaigning in the Civil Wars. For example, whilst acting as a scout in Tewkesbury, William Barnes was shot in the shoulder and elbow, and so constrained by reason of his hurts to get into a house, where suddenly, after his coming thither, the enemy, hearing his grievous groans and lamentations, entered the house, stripped him of his clothes, and took away all he had except his shirt, and would have cut his throat, had not the woman of the house besought them on her knees to spare his life. Philip Goldston regaled the JPs in Wiltshire with tales of his escape to a wood after a failed royalist uprising, where he lay for many days and nights in the cold without relief. In Essex, Oliver Bondon petitioned on behalf of his son, who was wounded in the Parliament service by falling from his horse at the Second Battle of Newbury. The wound had grown worse, partly by much marching and want of good provision. Lack of food was a perennial problem. Soldiers were expected to buy food out of their own wages, which were often late in being paid. In a petition to Edward Massey, the parliamentarian governor of Gloucester, Richard Coscombe related that he hath not a penny to buy bread, firewood, or other necessaries, while he was lying sick in the garrison, because he was much behind of his pay. The wounded prisoners in Bartley Castle were, like most soldiers, much more concerned about drink. They petitioned Massey, "We have bread and cheese, but not one drop of drink unless we pay for it, but we have no money." Imprisonment was also a common torment. In Derbyshire, John Rutledge could still remember vividly in 1687 how he had been imprisoned without any manner of satisfaction after his mare was shot from underneath him. Roland Harrison recalled to the JPs in the North Riding of Yorkshire how he was captured at Cirencester on Candlemas Eve, that is the 2nd of February, and lay in jail until the 2nd day of May following. He returned to service upon his release, but was again imprisoned after the Battle of Naseby. He was incarcerated for 8 weeks until, in a feat of daring do, he was 27 more, broke ye prison and got away. Around about 2/3 of petitions specify the military engagements that they or their husbands fought in. These range from the famous battles, such as Edgehill or Naseby, to obscure skirmishes that have never before been mentioned in military histories of the Civil Wars. For instance, in a clash between patrols from the Royalist garrison at Skipton, at the top there, and the parliamentarian garrison of Kildwick Hall, just at the bottom, one petitioner from the West Riding of Yorkshire, John Thorns, was apparently knocked down at Snaigall in taking one John Settle, a quartermaster, to the great danger of his life. If you search for Snaigall in the history books, you'll search in vain. However, after some detective work by Andrew Hopper, our principal investigator, it turns out that Low Snaigall is a watercourse just about a mile south of Skipton. Due to the placement of the garrisons, the skirmish itself must have taken place around about 1644 to 1645. As well as drawing our attention to previously overlooked encounters, the petitions can also help add to our knowledge of those events that are already familiar in military histories of the Civil Wars. The history books will inform you, for example, that an encounter at Heslington, outside York, took place during the siege of 1644. And during that encounter, the parliamentarian forces lost 9 men. Now, thanks to the petitions, we can name one of those men as Daniel Emming. Emming's widow Martha subsequently petitioned the Essex Quarter Sessions for a pension, explaining that at the siege at York, in a town called Haslington, within a mile of the said city, it pleased God to take away the life of my said husband. Elsewhere, on the 3rd of November 1645, parliamentarian forces under Sydenham Points stormed the garrison at Shelford House in Nottinghamshire as a precursor to besieging the royalist stronghold of Newark. The governor, Sir Philip Stanhope, was killed and almost all the defenders were massacred, whilst the house itself was burned to the ground. Why had the parliamentarian troops taken such shocking action? Well, Stanhope had refused Poynts' summons, which, by the rules of war, made his garrison subject to his storm. Which it surely did not help that Stanhope's soldiers were largely both Catholic and foreign. But the reason for the severity of the assault is perhaps best revealed by the sheer number of payments made to Maine soldiers in Nottinghamshire as a result of the action at Shelford House. It is clear that during the course of the assault that Poynts' men took an absolute pasting. And it's a common, if regrettable, fact of war that troops often take bloody revenge on those who have killed a large number of their comrades. soldiers are frequently reluctant to talk about the realities of combat. However, as petitioners were required to give precise information in their claims for a pension, this meant that this taboo had to be broken. As a result, the petitions contain many horrific descriptions of vicious hand-to-hand fighting. In Derbyshire, the frantic atmosphere of a skirmish at Shallcross Hall is strikingly well described in the petition of parliamentarian soldier John Colvard. He described the moment when Mr. Shallcross himself, entering the house, and a strong party with him, cut and wounded most of the soldiers found in the house, amongst whom your petitioner, who received such cuts and wounds that ever since he hath lost the use of his arm. In contrast, the tedium of sieges is equally apparent. Thomas Petchy spoke of how he endured a great deal of hardship at the siege of Colchester, whilst James Stockton claimed he was much weakened by the cold siege at Hull. Equally graphic are many of the veterans' descriptions of the wounds they received. And what makes these narratives particularly interesting is that, as the testimonies of wounded soldiers who actually survived the civil wars, they reveal crucial evidence surrounding the nature of the medical care available and what types of injuries contemporaries were capable of treating. Now, I think it's fair to say that in the popular imagination, early modern medicine has not enjoyed a favourable reputation. It is an image dominated by superstitious treatments, barbaric operations in unsanitary conditions, and, of course, leeches. That said, recent scholarship on the medical history of the Civil Wars is beginning to rescue practitioners from their reputation as bungling and dangerous amateurs, and the evidence from the petitions very much reinforces this revision in attitudes. I have myself analysed all the documents gathered by the project so far, and where named soldiers have specified the location of their wounds, I've noted these in the following diagram. This diagram shows us that the most common injuries survived by Civil War soldiers were located in their hands, arms and legs, the peripheries of the body. This verifies the observations of the Royalist Army surgeon Richard Wiseman, who later published a surgical treatise that included many case studies of his time in the military. Here he is. Wiseman noted that almost all gunshot wounds to the chest that penetrated either the major arteries or lungs were fatal, whilst wounds made by cutting weapons or gunshot that damaged the internal viscera of the belly were also likely to be mortal. Indeed, he claimed that if any recovered from such wounds, it was often because of miracles than the work of a surgeon. Similarly, Wiseman observed that penetrating wounds or large fractures to the skull that damaged the brain were largely uncurable, the patients dying howling like a dog. A parliamentarian army surgeon, James Cook, who too published his own surgical manual after the Civil War, was much in agreement with this assessment. Cook maintained that deep wounds of the brain, heart, spinal marrow, lungs, great vessels, etc. were all predicted to be mortal and cannot by art be cured. Now, despite this rather gloomy prognosis, the petitions from maimed soldiers revealed that Civil War surgeons were not put off from attempting to cure wounds to the head and torso, and they seem to have been surprisingly successful in healing difficult cases. I should probably pause here for a moment to say we're now moving on to the gory bits. Edward Bagshaw described to the West Riding of Yorkshire Quarter Sessions how at the Siege of York in 1644 he received many wounds and cuts in the head, insomuch that your petitioner had 9 bones taken out of his skull. The identity of the surgeon who treated Bagshaw is unknown, but it seems that he followed a standard procedure laid out in many contemporary surgical manuals, including those by Wiseman and Cook. fractures made by bullets drove in pieces of the cranium into the membrane underneath, surgeons were directed to cut open the scalp and raise up the loose bones. Wiseman himself warned practitioners not to take out more bones than needs must, claiming that he had met some surgeons who carried about the pieces in their pockets. The more pieces of bones that could be left in, the better, as this prevented damage to the soft parts underneath, and if dressed properly, would happily heal. Wiseman also recommended various pain relief medicines that could be used in treating skull fractures, as well as keeping the patient warm and plugging the patient's ears, lest the sounds of the operation disturb him. Most importantly, Wiseman suggested that the surgeon himself shut his own ears to concentrate on the operation, not listening to the prattling of the standers-by. However, what makes Bagshaw's case perhaps particularly extraordinary was that, as he informed the justices, all that nourished your petitioner for 3 weeks he received in it a hole in the side of his head. Enteral nutrition, the method by which patients are fed directly into the gastrointestinal tract, circumventing the usual processes of eating and digestion, can be a complex procedure even in modern medicine. Complications can occur, not least with a susceptibility to infection. Enteral nutrition, however, was not unknown in the early modern period, and a number of practitioners developed various techniques for the procedure. This illustration is from a surgical manual written by Johannes Skoltitus, town surgeon of Ulm in Germany, who became drafted into military service when Swedish soldiers captured Ulm in February 1632. He employed the use of what he termed a tunnel to feed barley broth to soldiers that he treated for severe wounds to the lower face. So I think what's interesting here is we've got obscure surgeons in Yorkshire that we don't even know their names, using some of the most pioneering techniques in Europe. Equally remarkable in its level of complexity was the successful treatment administered to John Latch, a soldier in the parliamentarian garrison of Gloucester. Latch recorded in his petition that when going out as a musketeer in a sally against Painswick in 1644, he there received in that fight 13 wounds, and there lay in misery from Monday till Tuesday following. Having been stripped and left for dead, Latch recounted that the enemy rode on me with their horse and denied me quarter, whereby my kidneys were rent from my loins, and some veins broken, whereby my body is weak through the loss of blood. It is probable that Latch was treated by a surgeon named Mr. Carradine, as another petition submitted in Gloucester at the same time by Corporal John Barrett described how Barrett was wounded in the same incident at Painswick and subsequently treated by Mr. Carradine, the surgeon. As with Latch, the enemy stripped Barrett and left him for dead, riding over him with their horses. In total, he received 7 wounds in the head, 5 of them through the skull, 1 cut in the back to the bones with a poleaxe, his elbow cut off, bones and all, his hand slit down between the fingers. Barrett had nothing but praise for Carradine, who had almost cured all of his wounds, and very carefully and willingly he had taken the pains to do it. Barrett's only concern was how to pay him, who was never the man who asked us for a farthing. Of course, in spite of all of these outstanding feats, it would only be right to point out that many soldiers suffered debilitating wounds that remained uncured for the rest of their lives. Richard Turner lamented to the Durham magistrates how he shot in the knee bone, which broke it into slivers, whereby the said Richard hath been a cripple ever since. The barber surgeon Thomas Cousin testified in a certificate to the Essex Quarter Sessions that William Gray was very much debilitated in his limbs, and infirm of body through an ulcer that he hath upon a joint in his shoulder, occasioned by a surfeit which did settle on that part. Likewise, I find that his leg hath been broken in many pieces, which hath occasioned a great imbecility in that part. Several veterans still carried the bullets that wounded them lodged in their bodies, souvenirs of the cause of their disabilities. For example, in the North Riding of Yorkshire, John Reed explained that he received several wounds and likewise a bullet which still lodges in his shoulder. Gangrene was a widespread problem. Indeed, Humphrey Masters disclosed to the Dorset County Committee that he was in great distress from having at this time a rotting leg, whilst Michael Powell told the Denbighshire JPs how a shot he had received in the arm at the Battle of Edge Hill, though partly being cured then, yet in the process of time festered again, and so corrupted that it grew to be a wolf or gangrene. All this being said, there is no escaping the fact that even these petitioners were the lucky ones, as they had survived to tell the tale of their injuries. The lives of the relatives of those who were not so fortunate had been made a whole lot more difficult by the death of their husband or father. Interestingly, many widows seem to have known the exact circumstances of their husband's death, such as Elizabeth Fowler. She told the Essex JPs that her husband lost his life by a shot before Loga Castle in the county of Limerick, the which was credibly certified to Mr. Hackledon Justice by one Samuel Downes, one who was a soldier in the service at the same time. Many widows presumably learned the sad news of their husband's death through returning soldiers who had fought in the same regiment. As we noted earlier, large numbers of troops were often recruited from the same geographical area, and so it is likely that many men will have served alongside neighbours. The parliamentarian laws and ordinances of war, which regulated behaviour in their armies, directed that the goods of all those who died in service were either to be disposed of according to the dead soldier's will, or, if he had no will, were to be returned to his wife or next of kin. It does not seem unreasonable to suggest that an officer or soldier from the same locality as the deceased was entrusted with the unhappy task of returning the goods to the widow. However, as Imogen Peck highlighted in an excellent article on war widows from the Civil Wars, not all widows received such certain news of their husband's fate. Husbands went off to the wars, often never to be seen or heard of again, but this did not necessarily mean that they had died. In the desperation of an army under attack, wounded men might be left for dead, and news of their demise reported back to their families for a certain fact. Peck related the story of Alice Bocock, whose husband, Thomas Barton, had marched with Cromwell's army into Scotland. Bocock heard no further news from him until Richard Nask of Skipton, a soldier who was lately come out of Scotland, told her that he was by and present when her said husband, Thomas Barton, was buried in Scotland. You can guess the ending. No sooner had she remarried than Thomas reappeared at her door, alive and well, and poor Alice was hauled off to the assizes to explain her bigamy. We can only guess if this case of mistaken identity on the part of the soldier reporting back to Alice was accidental or intentional. Either way, regardless of whether a soldier was actually dead or languishing out of communication in some far-flung corner of the country, the daily struggles faced by the women back home of making ends meet were the same. Yet missing presumed dead was not sufficient grounds on which to secure financial help. According to the legislation governing the pension scheme, widows were obliged to obtain a certificate from their husband's commanding officer, testifying to the soldier's service and death. Those, like Sarah Bott of Stebbing in Essex, who failed to produce such a certificate, were directed by the JPs to obtain one before a pension would be granted. In fact, securing a pension was no easy matter for any applicant. Money was in short supply, and the welfare budget correspondingly restricted. Plus ça change. The pensions distributed at the quarter sessions were dependent on a system of county-wide taxation, but years of sustained warfare had taken its toll on local communities. Many localities petitioned the quarter sessions to be alleviated from the burden of paying the tax for the maimed soldiers. For example, in Haslingden, Lancashire in 1661, the overseer of the poor, John Ogle, petitioned the sessions at Preston to be excused from caring for one maimed soldier, claiming ye town being very little and ye charge so great. Taxation is seldom popular, but those who lived through the civil wars saw taxation more than double from pre-war levels, and the war-weary simply refused to pay up. At the West Riding of Yorkshire quarter sessions, held at Barnsley in 1649, the JPs empowered churchwardens and constables collecting money for lame soldiers to levy a 20 shillings fine on those who refused to pay up. That said, when the constable of Ishellet in Denbighshire and his son distrained the goods of Hugh Lloyd for refusing to pay the maimed soldier's tax, Lloyd apparently ran furiously upon your petitioner, the son, kicked up his feet from under him, and upon the fall did drag and draw him by the hair of his head. Often, one suspects, refusal to pay the tax was politically motivated. The former royalist stronghold of Newark, for example, was not keen to pay the taxes that funded pensions for wounded parliamentarians during the 1650s. In addition to all of this, those who sought financial relief had to compete both with other petitioners and the large volumes of routine administrative business that took place at the sessions. Yet petitioners were far from powerless. Those who sought pensions knew exactly how to manipulate the system in their favour. Petitioners' cultural and political awareness influenced their decisions on which aspects of their stories to emphasise and, equally importantly, which to leave out. Most commonly, maimed soldiers and war widows attempted to represent themselves as the deserving poor. Maimed soldiers often stressed how they had hitherto earned an honest living and explained how their wounds now prevented them from following their trade. For example, in his petition to the Worcestershire quarter sessions, Arthur Bagshaw explained how a shot to his hand had put an end to his career as a tailor. Widows usually emphasised their role as mothers and almost always mentioned their now fatherless children. Sarah Bott told the Essex magistrates that her husband's death had left her with 5 small children in a very sad and deplorable condition, destitute of necessary maintenance. Soldiers were not reticent about mentioning their children either. In 1682, Henry Farr petitioned directly to Charles II, noting that he was 85 years old and had just lost his wife in childbed, giving birth to his 24th child. Some petitioners demonstrated an awareness of being a burden on their community and went into great detail of the lengths to which they had gone to maintain themselves by other ways. Joan Illery informed the Devon JPs how she turned to spinning and carding, whilst in Denbighshire, Mary Buckley pawned or sold all her worldly goods, whilst Michael Powell claimed that his wife was constrained to wander about the town to collect the charity of all well-disposed people. Persistence and a refusal to take no for an answer was often required on the part of petitioners. William Gray, the man we met earlier with the imbecilic leg, petitioned the Essex quarter sessions no fewer than 4 times until he finally secured a pension. Many were quick to draw the JP's attention to vacancies that had arisen through the death of existing pensioners, but others tried more underhand tactics. Claimants who uncovered instances of current pensioners who had been previously disloyal to the present regime were rewarded for their efforts. In 1648, Matthew Thackeray was awarded a pension of £2 by the Pontefract quarter sessions for snitching on George Thackeray and Henry Lee. Other pensioners attempted to cover up their dark past. John Allen and Nathaniel Lingard, both of Lincolnshire, chose to highlight how they were instrumental to the happy restoration of His Majesty by marching south with General Monk in 1660, rather than the years of service in the Cromwellian Protectorate that had preceded their departure from Scotland. Above all, it was imperative for petitioners to know their target audience. Toading up to the JPs rarely harmed. Martha Emming told the Essex bench that she did humbly prostrate both herself and her cause to your grave and serious considerations, not doubting of your wanted and known clemency and justice, laying it on with a trowel. Henry Norton, petitioning as late as 1710, made a cunning appeal to the religious preferences of the justices on the Northumberland bench by claiming that he'd been a true member of ye High Church of England. Obsequiousness was of the utmost importance for those claimants that aimed straight for the top and directed their petitions to figures such as Charles II. After the Restoration, some petitioners aimed directly at finances in the royal gift. Charles II was famous for his love of dogs, and there was no better way to gain the king's attention than by mentioning his canine companions. Elizabeth Carey, whose husband had been killed in royalist service, was in receipt of a pension directly paid from the Exchequer, but she petitioned Charles to transfer this to her son after her death. She was sure that the king would remember her son, as he had followed your Majesty to Oxford, and was there bitten by your Majesty's dog Cupid, as your Majesty may happily call to mind. I'd like to finish by considering how our petitioners look back on the nature of the civil wars themselves. Mark Style noted in his Devon study that petitioners usually avoided using harsh language to describe either their former enemies or the conflict itself. Perhaps this should be expected as people tried to rebuild their lives and shattered communities, and especially after the Restoration, when Charles II had decreed official oblivion for the past events. However, Mark noted that 7 Devon petitions, a small minority, referred to rebels, the rebellion, or the late rebellious times. This general pattern from Devon seems to be emerging from across the country. Most petitioners, like Roger Bundy in Worcestershire, simply refer to the unhappy wars. That said, I found the petitions in the Ely Quarter sessions were particularly acerbic. For example, Mary Saby petitioned on behalf of her grandchildren, whose father had, by the bloodthirsty people of the late times, been unjustly put to death and murdered. Since the outset of the wars, Ely had been an enclave of royalist support, which was bolstered at the Restoration by the return to power of Bishop Matthew Wren, one of Charles I's favourite prelates. There's a tendency to view the Restoration with an air of inevitable finality, the return of merry England with its equally merry monarch. There is an assumption that people simply view the past 20 years as a terrible nightmare which was best forgotten. Yet given the fact that communities had been immeasurably divided by the civil wars, the idea that the Restoration somehow represented a return to normality is, as David Appleby has argued, just bizarre. The petitions show that the maimed, the bereaved, the traumatised and the indigent were everywhere to be seen, visible reminders of the troubled past and communities burdened by heavy taxation, damaged local economies and degraded infrastructure. In such circumstances, those contemporaries who could not forget the emotions caused by the conflict might be forgiven. Indeed, the mental scars that may have been left by the civil wars is a subject worth considering. Amongst the surviving Maine soldiers' petitions exist tantalising glimpses of veterans that seem to have experienced psychological distress as a result of their Civil War experiences. As early as 1646, Margaret Buckler petitioned the Dorset County Committee on behalf of her son, who hath been a soldier for the Parliament and is now lunatic. In 1661, the Lancashire Quarter Sessions held at Preston heard that one Rafe Rishton hath for several years last past been a soldier, and about 3 weeks since come into Haslingden, and is since distracted and distempered. In 1672, John Cornelius, a Bishop Stainton, told the Devon Quarter Sessions that he was not only decrepit, but hath also lost the use of his reason by his grief. There are many methodological problems associated with identifying actual trauma in the past, and I'm not trying to do so here. However, these petitions do reveal two important points. Firstly, that contemporaries understood that wartime experiences could cause serious psychological conditions, and secondly, that such conditions were deemed worthy enough to require support with financial relief. The pension scheme that operated during the Civil Wars was not, of course, perfect. But what it does demonstrate is that for the first time, English governments recognised that the state had a duty of care, not only towards those who had fought in their service, but also to the families of military personnel. Stories of military injuries, bereavements and welfare might sound all too familiar to our 21st century ears. I wonder what the Civil Wars might teach us about military welfare provision to our armed forces today. Thank you very much.